Hi, this is JP Morgan.
And this is Kenneth Merrill, and we'd like to thank BORROWLENSES for sponsoring today's episode of the Slanted Lens.
A great place to check out equipment if you want to see exactly what you want to buy, like this new a6400.
Or the Fuji X-T30, which we're also going to be comparing today. We're really excited to try out these cameras. They're both pretty new, released in the last couple months or so, and they both have some pretty interesting features for their little small bodies.
They got great features like this little Star Wars robots pop-up flash. So let's start with our picture quality test and just see exactly how these two compare with each other.
Oh, and by the way, our model got in a car accident on the way here, so looks like you're stuck with me and JP.
So let's take a look at the image quality. I mean, that's really, I think, making a decision by camera according to what the image looks like is pretty important kind of criteria.
And these look very similar. I mean, it almost looks like it came out of the same camera. Now, we did correct for exposure a little bit. The Fuji was underexposed by about 1/3 of a stop compared to the Sony. But other than that, there were no color corrections or anything.
So all the ISOs are a little optimistic on the Fuji.
Yep. The next test we need to do is the dynamic range test. So we're going to shoot some over and underexposed images and then recover them in post and see what they look like.
I think this is a great test to look at the sensors on these two cameras and just see how they compare, how they're going to hold those highlights, how they're going to hold the shadows, if we can recover them, how far we can push them.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see how the X-T30 compares to the a6400. Sony usually does a really good job with dynamic range, and I'm excited to see how it looks.
All right, let's get to it.
Okay, so here we have our dynamic range test, and we shot both of these according to the light meter. We metered for that, metered for my face, and then we kind of brought in the highlights, brought up the shadows a little bit in post, but not much compensation other than that for this properly exposed image.
So we're going 4 stops over, 4 stops under. So at normal, they, again, look very similar. I mean, in this image right here, the Fuji looks just a little heavier in the shadows, but that could have been the way we processed it.
Yeah, we could have pushed it a little bit either way. I will say the Sony also does look a little bit warmer if you look at the brick.
Yep.
If we go under by 1 stop, honestly, I feel like both of these cameras look better under one stop.
Yeah, they do.
The Sony seems a little less blue in the sky. I feel like the Fuji picks up, it's either a cooler image overall or it picks up on blues better. 2 stops here might be where you start to see a little bit of noise because you're pushing the image around a little bit. That is another thing, the Fuji's a little more red in my shirt, whereas the Sony's more magenta.
That's at -3 stops?
Yeah,
definitely
-3
starting
stops.
to see the noise starting to creep in.
Feels very similar. The Sony feels a little more gritty.
There's a little more noise in the Sony than there is the Fuji, for sure.
But at the same time, I also feel like a little bit more detail, a little less grit in the Fuji. Okay, -4 stops.
-4 stops. I mean, digital just loves to be underexposed, doesn't it?
It really does. And the color looks pretty close. I mean, but I also feel like I'm a little more flat in the Fuji, you know? Like maybe there's a little more information in the Sony than there is. I don't know, it's so subtle.
It feels like the digital noise, though, on the Fuji is not as pronounced as it is on the Sony. The Sony feels like it's a lot more, it's starting to break down. It's starting to look like grain, pretty heavy grain there, but whereas the Fuji seems like it's holding together a little better.
I mean, +1, the background is starting to blow out, but I look great. The brick looks great.
Look at what I see is the cloud back there. Look at the cloud on the right-hand side, and that may be the sun the way it was on the cloud. It's very, very bright. It's not holding it. Whereas the Fuji,
it's hard to tell, honestly.
It's hard to tell because it's,
Well, let's do +2 stops here.
Yeah, +2 stops.
Actually, the Fuji is holding better at +2 stops. That brick on the back
is
not as clipped, not as blown out as the Sony. And then
3 stops.
+3 stops.
At this point, you have almost...
They're both falling apart like crazy.
Yeah, he falls off a cliff.
Interestingly, it almost feels like my face is held a little bit better on the Sony this time.
But look how the color is shifted, very similar. The color shift on both of them is very similar. It's a little yellow in your face. And I mean, I find that interesting. If we go to +4 stops...
That's just garbage.
It's like posterized at that point.
At +2 stops, I felt like the Fuji definitely has an edge on the dynamic range. But then at +3, they both look pretty much identical.
They do.
So hard to tell. Really hard to tell. Overall, I feel like in terms of dynamic range, maybe the Fuji has a slight edge because it's a little less noisy when you push it, and it might have a little more retention up to +2 stops, but beyond that, they're both pretty
they're very similar. Once again, like the picture quality, the dynamic range tests, they're very similar with one another. It's time now for our autofocus test. You know, autofocus is getting really incredible on most of these cameras, and I would guess they're both going to fare pretty well.
You know, the thing that always puzzles me is which detect to use. I mean, there's so many different detects. You have like eye detect and face detect and nose detect and ear detect and mouth detect, of course, tongue detect sometimes, button detect, teeth detect. The Sony a6400 has got to have one of the best autofocus systems at its price point.
Not just autofocus, but the buffering as you shoot on the a6400
Yeah.
is incredible. I mean, your shoot, it buffers a number of images is incredible.
It is incredible.
Whereas with the Fuji, we're having a hard time to get 20 images out of it, you know.
Yeah, the Fuji really limped along in terms of the buffer. But you look at this Sony, and we shot a ton of images here.
And it's just,
and
it's holding it as you
every
walk.
single image
Yep.
is sharp. It's really not until you get later on, you know, when JP is about 5-6 feet away. You get a couple soft ones, but honestly, all of these are really nice, and it comes back into focus when he gets really close. I think the glasses interfere.
Oh, I
a
think
little
the
bit.
glasses bring your eye. Well, they've got those reflections and things on the
Yeah,
eye,
yeah, yeah.
and it's messing up the eyeball. It's hard to track.
The Fuji, I was a little frustrated with on set. I felt like it wasn't focusing as well. We started with JP back. We actually did a couple runs with him starting further back than this. Yeah, we just suffered from the buffer. We couldn't shoot as many images. I felt like it wasn't tracking as well, but we look at these and they are sharp, most of them.
Yeah, it's not terrible.
It's
I mean,
not
they're sharp.
terrible.
But you're shooting half as many images.
And when you were starting further back, it had a really hard time going from focusing on, like it couldn't find you.
Yeah.
And so I found that the tracking worked better on the Sony because it could find JP when he was further away.
I think obviously the Sony is doing a much better job here with the autofocus and the auto tracking.
And the buffer and
the
everything.
buffer.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
those
agree.
three things really come into play there, and you get the ability to have somebody walk towards you and you're shooting and staying with them, and it looks fabulous.
Having said that, I mean, the Fuji did okay. It's
did.
not a reason I wouldn't buy the camera. It's not a deal breaker, unless you're shooting action or a lot
If you're
of
shooting
frames
action
and
sports where
stuff.
people are running straight at you, probably not the camera.
The next thing we're going to test is the video capabilities on these cameras. Both of them have a log profile. The Fuji has F-Log and the Sony has S-Log. S-Log, of course, is kind of like standard these days. I'm really curious to see how F-Log pans out, especially when you're shooting on, you know, smaller sensor, smaller body, generally lower end camera. You never know how it's going to shake out.
People are going to want to know this because a lot of these cameras are going to be used for vlogging, and so they're going to want to look at those logs, see if that's a value, or just as a B camera. So let's take a look at the logs.
Right out of the box, the Sony is flatter and
It
less
is.
saturated than the Fuji. I actually used the F-Log LUT that Fuji provides on both of these cameras. I thought they both looked pretty good, so I ran with it. I made a couple tint adjustments and a couple contrast adjustments to both of them, but I think they both look very similar and they both look really nice.
I mean, our color a little bit, if you look at this close-up shot, if you look at my face, on the right is a little more, it's just a little more neutralish to warm, whereas with the Sony, it's a little bit yellowish.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
maybe that could be the LUT that we've got on there. A
I
little
mean,
bit.
yeah, you could push it one way or the other. I do feel like you're right. The Fuji seems a little more neutral, whereas the Sony definitely has a look to it. Two things I want to know are the focus is hunting on the Sony because I think we left on autofocus by accident. I did add a little bit of sharpening to tack up the Sony's footage to match the Fuji, which is a little sharper out of the box. The last thing I want to say too is that the Sony has a little more color noise in the shadow areas and across the sweater if you look really close. I think it's because it has a lower data rate and also the profile's flatter. So it's struggling to pack more information into less space.
If you're going to shoot a log on, you can grade this. It's going to look nice. They both look very good. I'm having a hard time being unhappy with one of these.
I know, right? They're both
really
really
am.
nice. I will say the Fuji does have a 10-bit output for video, so if you wanted to, get nicer quality video, you could output it through this. Though I feel like it'd be a little silly to throw Atomos on top of this thing.
It's like a third the size of the Atomos. Time to head back to the studio and do our ISO test.
Now, I know that some people out there these days are telling you that ISO doesn't exist, but I, for one, still believe in ISO.
We here at the Slanted Lens believe in ISO. The Fuji is just, it's underrated. It's under by a half a stop.
Yeah, it's definitely darker, and you see that here because we didn't correct it. 1600 ISO starting out. You already see some grain. It's not as clean as you see out of some of the higher end cameras. If you're going to spend $2,000 or $3,000 on a camera, you could probably shoot at 1600 without as much noise as this.
Especially the Sony. Look at the Sony. I mean, I'm feeling a pretty heavy grain pattern in the Sony. Not quite so much in the Fuji, but then the Fuji's under a half a stop too.
Right, so if you boost that Fuji by
this up
half a
to,
stop, then...
yeah, it's going to make a big difference.
All right, 3200 ISO.
Yeah, boy, they're both breaking up pretty bad.
Both are.
Yep.
Again, at this
Really
price
bad,
point,
actually.
at this price point, you can't expect too much.
No. Yeah, 6400. Yeah, we're goodbye.
I actually feel like the Fuji's almost getting worse more quickly than the Sony.
Maybe a little bit.
I don't know.
Really heavy grain on both of them. 12,800. Everyone shoots at 12,800.
I would say at 12,800, I actually like the Sony better personally. Actually, shooting those tests, I wouldn't shoot either of these beyond 1600.
I feel like we started and it was a
if
problem.
That, yeah.
I'd be back at 800 or maybe 400, you know,
Yeah.
and to be comfortable and to really have a nice image. So, because you may have this sense, well, you know, all cameras today, you know, you can push them way further than you really can, and it's not the case. And the different sensors are going to respond differently.
Absolutely. So ergonomically, what do we think about these? Having shot on these all day now.
Well, first off, I feel exactly the way I feel about Fuji every time. It really has a retro feel. You got the aperture on the lens, you got the shutter dial. I mean, it's just, I mean, it has that very retro feel, and I like that. But it's a little tiny.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. I've always been a fan of Fuji because I like that retro feel. I like having the dials where they are, I like the aperture on the lens. I can't tell you how many times I hit that Q button when I was just grabbing it, or I bumped the ISO on the back dial here, or I accidentally hit menu or bumped the joystick. I mean, the problem is it's such a tiny camera and they're trying to pack so many little buttons onto it that there's no real estate left to actually hold it. And it doesn't help that...
Gotta hold buttons.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't help that the grip does not protrude very much. It's a very subtle grip. And so it's just hard to hold, and my hand feels cramped.
If you had smaller hands, you'd probably love it. It'd be great. You know,
Yeah,
it wouldn't
that
be a
might be
problem,
true.
but
On the other hand, the A6400, so many numbers, feels really great. I think that for a camera this size, the grip protrudes just enough. I feel like it's contoured really nicely to my fingers. I don't feel like I'm going to drop it or anything. This is a super compact camera that packs a really heavy punch, and I like it a lot. I like it a lot. I'm surprised because usually when it comes to ergonomics, Sony is my last pick. But in this case, it is the first.
the screens, though, you know, you got the screen, which is just on the Sony is, okay, yes, I know why you did it. It's a vlogging camera. You want to have that screen up so you can see it. It's a little bit of a stretch to make that work, but hey, it works a whole lot better than not having one at all.
Right.
These are the same price. I mean, they're like with $1. One's 98, one's 99. They're within $1 of each other.
It's a tough pick.
It's a tough choice. It's a tough choice. It really is. Color-wise and log-wise and image quality, I mean, they are so neck and neck. In the specs, I feel like you're looking at the very same camera. It comes down to what feels comfortable in your hand. You know, the way you like to work, what you like to do. I think this is well, I can't say this is a stronger video camera. They both do 120 frames in 1080p.
And they both looked really good.
They both look great. So I can't say one's better as a video camera over the other. I think both these cameras fall in the category of very advanced. I don't want to say prosumer, because I think it's a little, maybe perhaps a little lower than that.
Yeah.
But definitely advanced amateur, you know, who wants some really great images and a small camera to carry. Great travel camera, my word.
Great travel camera, both of them.
Very small and compact, easy to travel with. So.
Clear winner? I don't know. I don't think there is one.
No clear winner. Nope. Really isn't. I mean, I don't think you could I couldn't say by any means. So great offering there from both these camera companies. Absolutely put your comments below, things that you're interested in, and keep those cameras rolling.
And keep on clicking. I lid detect, pupil detect, ear detect, hair follicle detect sometimes.